Dr. Bradley Grant is back with us on the Abundant OD podcast. Bradley,
Thank you for having me.
nice to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure talking.
Yeah, you bet. So we were just catching up a little bit before the show and talking a little about if people remember from last time, I always refer to it as a program, I guess, but this initiative that you have
Yeah,
for helping and a passion really born from a passion of helping young ODs get into private practice on their own through a unique setup. Do you want to kind of remind people the nuts and bolts or the like? I guess we don't have to get that far, but the
yeah,
broad overview of that. Let's
yeah,
call it that.
absolutely. And I think that program is a fair enough term for process program, however you want to call it. But
Yeah.
when I first came out of school, many years ago, I cold started right out of school, and that's hard. It's difficult. It's a lot of work. It's exciting, very much a challenge. But I just remember thinking that this was a lot of work and a lot of things that you come across that you just have to learn on the fly, like nobody teaches you necessarily. And so as we've been many years in practice and we were acquiring different locations and building upon that, we thought, gosh, it would have been fantastic if there would have been some kind of practice back then that would have had an opportunity to be a part of a practice and then buy in and make it your own, knowing that from the beginning. And it's not that different than maybe an associate coming into an existing practice. But what we do different is that the locations are remote. They're not necessarily attached to our home office. And those doctors are there by themselves, really operating the clinic as if they were cold starts or had bought them on their own. We're on the backside supporting with the infrastructure. We obviously are the financial infrastructure for it as well. And then those doctors learn how to manage those practices, learn how to manage staff, learn how to manage schedules, coding and billing, all the things that result in do you get paid or not, which is semi-important in terms of business, and then they are able to buy in over time. And for them, it's a practice that they're well familiar with and understand the cash flows and the dynamics of how to be profitable before having to go out and necessarily take the risk themselves, right? We bear the risk. We obviously do a lot of vetting on what we think is a good opportunity for those practices, but it's a good situation for the success of the practice and the success of the young OD who wants to ultimately own because they've got quite a bit of runway to learn.
Yeah, for sure. I think I mean, it's just really fascinating to me because I haven't heard of anybody else doing it quite like you are.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm hearing is they have the ODs that you're taking on under your wing here with this process. Not only they kind of have a built-in mentor,
Mm-hmm.
plus which, a lot of us in business can get or find or seek
Right.
out, but they also have all I mean the infrastructure support that you were talking about with the financial and the accounting and just kind of having that all figured out. I can tell you from experience of working with several cold starts over the years that's a huge piece to have
Yeah.
kind of lifted off their shoulders and not have to piece through or figure out, right?
Yeah.
And
If I could kind of, highlight just what we found was those, I guess, main areas of need whenever you talk
sure.
about your cold start. And, the clinical side, usually is not an issue, right? We found that most doctors are really well trained these days, and they're really
Mhm.
passionate about many different aspects of eye care. And so most of the time, that's just almost enabling them to unleash that passion. But coding and billing is a big one, right? Seeing a patient and then translating that into dollars in the bank is a huge one. So we have, I touch base with my doctors in the program weekly, and we talk about
Mm.
codes that we're using and how we build them and insurance companies. So that's a big one. Staff management, staff training. We have individuals within our system that are in charge of training staff in different levels of the office, whether that's technicians or opticians. And then inventory management is a really, really
Mm.
big. And I'm sure that you see that with cold starts as well. As how many frames do we need? Am I managing this well? Am I paying attention to it? Am I overspending on my inventory? And that's a huge number if your cost of goods sold are inflated, especially in smaller offices. And the margins are not that. You can't spend 5% more on your cost of goods sold in a practice that's $500,000. That's just too much.
Right.
So having inventory management from the start, it has been very helpful. And then having active conversations about what we're doing, why we're making the decisions in the process that we are, helps them hopefully that when it's theirs and 100% their decision, they don't have to do what we do now. They can do whatever they want, but hopefully it's at least been a good reference for them.
Yeah, for sure. And no, I think that's terrific because like I said, those are the types of things that if you don't have, even if you had like mentor, consultant, somebody out, mastermind group, whatever it is, right? The fact that this is very, regular, consistent contact, I think you said weekly, that just, because things in between, like, things in between uh month to month in my own business come up and theirs does too, where it comes up and you're just kind of, if you don't have somebody to like turn to and tap on the shoulder, if you've never been through it, it's kind of like trial and error almost.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
but then it sounds like the other thing that I'm taking note of as you're talking about this is you're giving them enough freedom in their own, in this business, in this practice to be able to, think through the process. So you're giving them a framework, decision making, some tools to help make those decisions, and then you're still allowing them to grow and develop so that they can make those decisions for themselves later on when that time comes.
Right.
So it's really a strong, management development process you've got going there.
Right. Right. I
Yeah.
think a lot of young doctors have passions for certain specialties, whether that's dry eyes or myopia management or a variety of different things, and so it's easy to say I want to do that, right? I want to do that as part of the clinical day to day. Well, the conversation that we have is great. Show me how much that costs. Show me how we're going to institute that into the schedule. Show me how many patients we have already on our in our EHR that would be eligible for that service, how much is it going to cost to implement it, and run the numbers for me, and make a case for me that we should buy this piece of equipment, or make a case for me that it's going to be profitable. And it doesn't mean that if they do it, it's an automatic yes. It's still our risk and ours, but it at least gets them thinking in the way of, okay, there's things I want to do. There's a cost to everything that I want to do. Sometimes pro, sometimes con. Let's think through the actual logistics of how we translate what we want into what we get to do. And so we hope that we're, establishing some critical thinking along those lines that make it more successful over time.
Yeah, for sure. Do you ever find it, it's a little bit different, I suppose, for you because you are, you are in that seat where, you're especially before the ownership is transferred over that, you're, you've got a big hand in that decision. But do you ever find it difficult for them? I know it's a small data set for you, right? Because I think there's only a couple going through it.
Yeah.
But do you ever find like any resistance or pushback or like just any resistance at all to just like slowing down and thinking through? Because basically what you're doing is something very similar to what we do in our office too, which is having them think through an entire business model so that before we start pulling triggers and saying yes and signing things, right, and acquiring things, that we know once all that minutia, the litany of work is done to do all the things that you're just talking about, right? And once you get on the other side of that, is this thing going to be profitable? Are you still going to like your practice? Are you still, your schedule still going to work out? Like all that stuff. But, of course, I'm in a much different position because I can't like withhold a signature funds and say, hey, we're just not going to do it. They just show up next time and they're like, hey, I did a thing. I'm like, okay. So I just out of like selfish curiosity on my part, if you ever run into that, like resistance and get them to slow down and go through that process.
I would say, in a fair answer, I would say, because I think that we're passionate about something. We, a lot of us have a tough time saying, let's wait. But what we've tried to, and what I really truly believe is that, especially when we talk about, use the example of specialty care in the clinic, right? specialty care is built out of a robust primary care clinic, right?
Yeah.
You have to have time. I think sometimes it's more the discussions about the schedule, or, oh, I want to dedicate, 3 days a week to specialty contact lens care. Well, that's great. But if we only have 4 of those patients a week, we're wasting, 2 days where we could be seeing regular patients. So
Yeah.
it's just working through the details of saying, there's certain things that you're passionate about, but in eye care, the bread and butter is still primary care, optometry. It's still, medical management of conditions, cataracts, glasses,
Mhm.
glaucoma, and you still have to be very, very well involved in that. And from that, we offset specialties and services that are extra. But so sometimes I think it's putting the cart before the horse in terms of saying all of this comes from a robust primary care optometric practice. That's what's first, specialty second, not the other way around. And I
Yeah.
may have people that disagree with that, but that's how I've seen it play out.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I am on the side of agreeing with you because I've seen it kind of both ways as well. I mean, I've seen specialty services that start up too soon, or without that kind of robust primary care aspect, and it's similar results that you're alluding to, which is it just doesn't end up working out or working out as well as it could or probably should.
Mm-hmm.
So so yeah, and like to be fair, like I know some people that I like have current conversations with will probably listen to this. So just to be fair, like I've been guilty of this same thing early on in my business career too, like
Mm-hmm.
jumping in full steam on something, being like, I'm really super passionate about this. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, that's great, except for like, for me, it was kind of like, look at the demographics around you and figure out like, they're not really of the same mindset. So you're not going to
Mm-hmm.
get a lot of good looks here
Yeah.
on this service offering, right? It's like, oh, I didn't do the market research. I thought, hey, it applies to
Yeah.
everybody, but forgot the whole mindset
Yeah, and
aspect. But
in fairness to that point in my uh, everything that I'm saying is because I've made the mistake before that
yeah,
that I've learned that my wife might say, were you talking about buying practices when you were talking about buying a piece of equipment? But
yeah,
it all
exactly.
all good
I th
information.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of wisdom comes from, is from
Mhm.
those mistakes and missteps, right? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, if we knew that back then, so we're saving people trying to at least saving them
Mhm.
the learning curve and the trials and tribulations there.
Yeah.
So that's great.
Yeah, and
Um,
I want to last point on that. I just want to make
yeah,
sure, just in case some of my associates are listening to this. I have been incredibly floored by their progress, their dedication, their growth. A lot of them, very new out of school, and when we look back at the conversations that we're having, day one versus day 300 versus day 400, right? The growth, the knowledge, all that they have, soaked up and put in the extra effort that isn't clinical to learn has been astounding to me. And so I just want to make sure that is the main take home is, that every conversation and relationship is, has its frustrations, but, they have
yeah, for
been
sure.
phenomenal to work with.
Very good. Well said. So, going away from that just a little bit. So, the other thing we were chatting about early on, or before the call, I should say, is
Mm-hmm.
something that. So, we took you kind of through a process, and somewhere to prep for the podcast, and somewhere in there, lodged or dislodged rather, shook loose an idea that you had that I think a lot of people have had, especially if you're in business for yourself, especially if you have a family. A lot of people have had and maybe not taken action on. I know for myself, like I was well into my business career before I took action on these things as well. And so you mentioned you kind of created an SOS list, I think you had called it, for
Mm-hmm.
your wife and your family. Tell us a little bit about what that is in general for first, and then we can dive in a little bit further maybe into it.
Right. So a lot of it spurred from just some conversations, one that my wife and I had in terms of, the way that everybody's family dynamic works a little bit different, with myself being the business owner and the one that's kind of in charge of the finances. Then I see the money in and out, different accounts, and that's have it transferred over where you know my wife doesn't necessarily log into a website to move money or make deposits, that kind of thing. So starting to think about, well, what would happen if I wasn't here, right? What would happen if I something happened to me on the way to work tomorrow, and all of a sudden, she's responsible for making sure that all the bills are paid, everything is funded, the different moving pieces that we have with our organization. And talking about the program that we have different business entities that are optometric practices. We have different business entities that are real estate holdings companies. We have different insurance plans. We have 401ks. We have individual IRAs. We have life insurance policies. We have a lot of moving pieces in addition to just our general business checking accounts for all those different entities. And really the only one that knows how to access all of that is me. And if I'm not here, that's a problem. That's a big problem. And so that's what spurred it on. And so just making sure that I had all of that consolidated in one space to say, these are the accounts that we have. This is the life insurance that we have. This is the policy number that we have. This is how you get into these accounts. This is who you contact when you need to be able to access those accounts. As you deal with practice owners all the time, we have general life insurance, personal life insurance. We happen to have a term policy just based on we were able to acquire it when I was quite younger. So it was a great rate for many, many years. But we also have buy-sell agreements, where key man policies with partnerships that we have. So, all encompassing, there's quite a bit of money in terms of life insurance that protects my family as well as protects my current business partners. And so everybody needs to know how to access that. It's really either a incredibly stressful situation or it's, I'd like to think sad situation, but, not as stressful if something happens to me.
Right. For sure. Yeah. And it's, I think I've talked to, several business owners across a lot of industries in the past and still do, but this is one thing that seems to be a little, I don't know, just depending on what stage of business you're in, may seem to fly under the radar or, not be thought about as intensely. Is like you probably have, your will and some basic estate planning tools, maybe a power of attorney or medical directives, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The things that a personal, either financial planner or CPA or estate planning attorney that is used to handling individual clients, right, will talk about. But, the depth that you're talking about is much needed is getting into all the stuff that the business owns. And, and if you have several businesses, then it's just, you pile those on and list them out. But people seem not to think about it all the time. The fact that, hey, not only, we might have our joint accounts, and I have, we might have our own, depending on how each couple manages their money. You might have your own accounts, husband and wife. But there's all these business accounts that, like you said, I'm the only one that can access, and you were too. And it's like, that creates a huge problem and much more stress than what is needed, I guess I would just say, because it's all, as you find out, and is pretty obvious, it's all fairly avoidable. The amount of stress for not having this stuff laid out and figured out, versus having it laid out. Yeah, it's still going to be stressful. It's still going to be, they're still going to be sad. They're going to be going through a grieving process, but it just, if they had to try and figure out or, go through all the motions with the courts and the banks and all that stuff to get it, to gain access when it wasn't already given ahead of time, is just, adding way too much undue stress. Are there other things, you talk about bank accounts, just kind of having quote unquote everything all in one place? And you mentioned buy-sell agreements, and that's important for, anybody with partners to have. And, if they're, so is there anything else you can think of that was kind of like something that hit that list that you maybe didn't think about it at first, but as you were going through the process, you're like, oh, maybe I should definitely add this thing to it? Or was that pretty much cover it, most of it?
Well, I think it's also just thinking about, so you think about the assets that you have, right? And the
Hmm.
greatest assets that I have are my businesses, right? But how does my presence or lack of presence affect the value of that business, right? And so um, we have worked really hard to make our businesses not dependent on one doctor, right? And we have multiple locations, multiple associates, and so tomorrow, if I'm not there, we can still see patients, and it's still a viable business that is an asset, not just for my family after the fact, but for the partners that I have. But if nobody knows how to get into those accounts, if nobody knows how to run payroll, right, the staff isn't going to stay around a long time if they're not getting paid, right?
Right.
And so it also kind of highlighted some of those areas where it says, where I had to think, okay, on the day-to-day business standpoint, do I have staff members in place who can take over XYZ responsibility? And I think it really motivated me even further to say, it doesn't mean that I shouldn't be involved in some of those day-to-day operational things, but if I wasn't there, would the business be able to function in the same way that it does now? Just nobody sees Dr. Grant, right? They see a different
Mhm.
doctor, but the staff continue to get paid. The 401s continue to get funded. The insurance continues to be funded. All of those things that I think sometimes as business owners, we're just used to saying, well, I'll just do it because it's easy for me to do it, right? I'll just log into bill pay and pay the electric bill because it's easy for me to do it.
Mhm.
But at some point, somebody else is going to have to be able to do it because the survivability of that business is the sustainability of that asset, whether it's for your family or for those that are still there. I'll butcher the stat, but I've heard on podcasts before that in the instance of a solo practice, right? And let's say that I think this stat was given for dentistry, but if a solo practitioner, no other doctor, the value of that business in the absence of the owner declines 10% a week
Mm.
when the owner's gone. And so you think about that, you think, gosh, so the moment that you're not there, your staff, your doctors, your family are under the gun to be able to continue to make that asset what it should be, what it is. And so that was, I guess, an offshoot of that was saying, do I have enough infrastructure in place with my own business to where I have staff that are performing those tasks that if I was not there, would it be a 50% decline in revenue, or would it just be a different doctor that sees the patients? And that's the
Yeah.
goal, right? I don't know that we're there yet 100%, but that should be the goal because that's the most successful business. That's the most successful asset that I can deliver and create to my partners and to my staff.
Right on. Yeah, that's really interesting that you brought that up. I don't know the stat off the top of my head either, but I
Mhm.
um I don't think that's far off.
Yeah. I don't think you can ever go
It,
wrong with just randomly quoting podcasts that you've listened to, right? I mean, it has to.
if you just randomly, like make up stats because they
Yeah.
sound good, then
I, I,
they have to
I
be right.
mean,
They
especially if it
have to
makes
be
a
right.
point, right? I mean,
Exactly. If it supports our cause, we're good with it. I've known people in different industries, pretty much in the financial services sector, that I don't want to. They weren't out looking for it, but they just came across these opportunities, similar things, right? It was a solo professional practice, and something did happen to that professional, and they ended up coming in, hearing about it, having the conversations, and came in and would buy the practice for pennies on the dollar. I
right,
mean, literally just
right,
10%, 20% of what the practice would have been worth if, if the owner, say the owner were still alive and they went to sell it to
right,
another professional. And it's not that they were, not in a bad sense if you think about that, because some people may listen to that and think, oh, they're, taking advantage of a grieving widow or something
right.
like, and that was
Yeah,
not the case at all. Because if you think about it, if whether you're solo practice or not, right? If you don't have the processes that you're talking about all laid out, like somebody's got to come in and figure that out. Somebody
right.
also has to come in and figure out the service delivery or fulfillment aspects, where you're at with everybody. It's kind of like if you didn't, I don't know what the equivalent would be in your field, but if you didn't have accurate notes or charts updated and things like that, right? Which you probably always do, but I'm just saying, like somebody
Yeah,
had to come in and figure that stuff out in order to take over that practice, and they're trying to get something for that spouse, because otherwise that surviving spouse has zero. I mean, they can't step
Right.
in and run it, right? They weren't
Right.
the licensed professional.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, a lot of, I mean, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, the spouses aren't working. I mean, if you think of just solo practices now, I know a lot of spouses do work, but a lot of them don't. That was kind of one of the good, or uh, just kind of one of the aspects of having the person start the practice in the first place, was at some point I'm going to be able to retire you, and whether
Right.
it's raise your kids or whatever other lifestyle goal they had there for that. So they're not working. They can't run the practice. And so now all of their income outside maybe whatever life insurance was available was all that they would get, and
Right.
still have to, and then they don't have the SOS document and
Right.
process. So they're going through all these things with some stranger, essentially,
Right.
right, to
Right.
them,
Yeah.
that's trying to help them out. But it's a mess. It gets to be a mess for everybody involved.
I think at the end of the day, right, a business is worth two values, right? One, ultimately, what anybody else is willing to write a check for, right? So it's all relative, right? It may have been worth something a week ago. It's not. If there's nobody out there willing to write a check for it, it's not worth it. And two, what's the predictability of consistent cash flow in the future, right? And like you said, if they don't have the systems in place that
Right.
would deliver cash flow if acquired in the state that it's in, and they have to put in time and effort and money, the value goes down, right? It just has to. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, so the more that we can play defense on that, the more that we can say we're hedging against cash flows going down in the absence of myself or someone else, then we're doing our best to ensure the value of that asset.
Right. Right. Yeah. Very good. We all hear, at some point in our business career, we all hear these, comments where people tell us about, systems and processes, and you don't really have a business until you have those in place, right? Otherwise, you
Mm-hmm.
just have a glorified job. But this
Right.
conversation is really like
Yeah.
a one that you own, right? It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
um,
It's a good job, but
it's a good job. The boss is kind of
yeah.
a a-hole sometimes, but
Be a
other than
stickler. Yeah.
that,
Terrible
uh,
about giving time off, right?
yeah,
Never any
yeah,
time off.
no, very little time off, no paid holidays. What the heck? Um, but no, but I think this conversation just really was a short deep dive into a lot of elements of why that's important. So if people have had that on their mind or have heard of it before, you really start to figure out like, hey, this it's not just lip service somebody's giving you, and people know it's important, but just when you think through to the family impact. Like I asked earlier, if your wife was like super happy to receive this information or relieved, or like what the emotions were
Yeah.
behind that on her end. And I think, if it were my wife, it would be like, uh, there's probably a bit of surprise that I was taking those steps in the first place. It's just, and then like,
Yeah.
and then the relief factor would set in, like, oh,
Hmm.
like, I'm not in the dark, so to speak, because
Yeah.
whether we have those conversations or not, I think our spouses are thinking about the same thing.
Right.
At least at some point, maybe not actively every day, of course, but at some point that thought and that scenario creeps into their head too,
Yeah.
right?
And yeah, I think all of us, peripherally experience it with family and friends, and it triggers those thoughts, right? Okay, what if this situation hits closer to home, right? What does that look like for us? And so, I think sometimes if you don't have that in place, and that was me, just shortly before, a few month ago, I had to listen to that trigger that clicked a few times to say, look, stop thinking about what it would be like, just fix it, do it, sit
Yeah.
down and fix it. So there it is.
And you did it, and I commend you for it. That
Yeah.
was awesome. Quick action.
Yeah.
It's good. Bradley, is you always bring such great and insightful conversations, so I really appreciate you taking out the time. I know we're a little bit over time, so I want to be respectful. Anything else? Any final thoughts in closing, or you think we've pretty much covered it all?
No, I really appreciate again you reaching out, and like I said, it's always a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully this is maybe something that helps someone. And, we hope on these SOS documents, it's something my wife never has to access for decades. But I hope it was a colossal waste of time. but if it isn't, then it'll be worth it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it's a great,
Yeah.
if nothing else, it's a great insurance policy, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's good stuff. Thank you so much for your time, Bradley. Appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All right.